Growing up, I always knew my family was different. When I was 7, we moved from a crummy single-bedroom downtown apartment to a 5-bedroom, 3-story suburban with a swimming pool and a tennis court in the backyard. It was a huge move, but I was just a kid, more concerned with Pokemon and Little League than why or how we'd relocated. I loved my brand new, very own bedroom, and I loved the backyard and the pool and all that stuff. But not once did I ever ask how or why we'd moved there. I also very naively thought that just because we'd moved to a place like that, we were exactly the same folks as the people who were now our neighbors. But it was only when I started to hang out with some of the neighborhood kids that I really noticed how different we were. One of the first things I noticed was that pretty much everyone talked differently than we did. I don't want to say exactly where I'm from, but the inner city accent is very distinct from the one in the suburbs, and since it was such an obvious change, that was the first major thing that struck me as different. The next thing was the way the other kids' parents acted. Both my mom and dad smoked cigarettes. They smoked inside when we lived in the apartment, like I had quite vivid memories of having ashtrays around and stuff, but when we moved, they tried to smoke outside to keep from messing up their new house. This meant that Mom was almost permanently lounging on one of the patio chairs, smoking a cigarette with either a coffee or a glass of wine. But when it came to other moms, they didn't smoke. I never saw them drinking, and they never, ever cursed in front of their kids. On top of that, other moms seemed to actually do stuff. They had jobs, careers, or they were members of the PTA or the HOA or any number of other TLAs, these 3-letter acronyms. There were a lot of nannies in other kids' families because both of their parents had very busy schedules. But all my mom did was lounge around the house, occasionally go out to get her nails or hair done, while my dad stayed away at work for days at a time. I also had no idea what my dad did for a living. Other kids knew exactly what their dad or mom did for work, be it a doctor or lawyer or whatever, but I think I must have been around 11 or 12 the first time I actually asked him how he made his money, and all he told me was shipping, and that his job was boring. Like I said, I kind of knew we were different. I just didn't see anything wrong with it, and on its own, there is nothing wrong with a working-class family making themselves some money and then moving up in the world. But in my family's case, things weren't that simple, and they weren't that innocent either. One afternoon, in my freshman year of high school, the vice principal pulled me out of class and called me to her office. I thought that I might have done something wrong, so I was already kind of nervous when I got to her office. But when I saw her sitting at her desk with one of my aunts sitting in front of her, I realized something else was happening, and whatever it was very clearly bad. It wasn't even so much that my aunt was there, it was the look on both of their faces. They obviously had bad news to share with me, and up until that point, it was the worst news I'd ever received in my entire life. My mom and dad had gone missing, and for the foreseeable future I'd be staying with my aunt. Now, there are 2 things you need to know here. First off, missing wasn't some kind of stand-in word for something else. They hadn't been in some kind of horrible accident, not to our knowledge anyway, and there was no sign of them being hurt in any way. Instead, they were just gone. My aunt had been due to meet with my parents in the morning, just after I left for school, but when she arrived, there was no one home. The cars are in the driveway, the TV is on, but neither of my parents were anywhere to be found. My aunt got in through an unlocked back door, same one we always kept unlocked, and chilled in the house for a while in the hopes that they might soon return. But they didn't, and after looking all morning for them, she realized something weird and potentially very bad was going on. This was before cell phones were widespread too, so there was no calling them to see where they were, only calling places that they might be to see if they were there. But again, there's no sign of either my parents at any of their usual hangouts, so she swings by my school to make sure I'm okay, and that's when I got called into the office. Second thing you need to know, my aunt wasn't really my aunt. I had a whole bunch of aunts and uncles who weren't really related to me. And I know what you're thinking, but no, it wasn't some Italian-American thing with an Uncle Vinny and Uncle Tony. It was a whole bunch of people who were around my family when I was growing up who basically took on that status to me. And that was another kind of weird thing. I didn't have much family in the traditional sense. I have these vague memories of seeing a grandpa when I was very young, but then when it came to who'd be taking care of me in the absence of my parents, it fell on my aunt. I'm not saying I'm not grateful for that. She treated me like I was her own flesh and blood, always had done, hence the name aunt. But that was definitely another weird inconsistency that I noticed as time went by. Other kids had blood relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents they saw on the regular, but not me. I didn't have anyone but this motley assortment of my parents' friends and associates who all stopped by to pass on their condolences and ask if they could help out. I say condolences like someone knew that they were dead or something, but it wasn't like that. They were just sorry that I was going through something so awful and, like me, hoped my parents would show up again soon. Anyway, from the ages of 14 to about 19, I really struggled with the fact that they seemed to have just disappeared. Eventually, there came a point where it was very obvious that people were expecting to find bodies, and not live people. And the most messed up thing is, I actually wish that were true. In my mind, I'd rather they had been killed in some freak accident than they willfully abandoned me. Not just me either. They left their entire lives behind and they didn't even bother to tell us why. Did I matter that little to them? That they'd just up and run off like that without even saying goodbye? That was the question that had me wishing that they were dead. Not something I'm proud to look back on, but it was a way of dealing with the pain of it all, I guess. Then, after 5 years of adjusting to the idea that I was never going to see or hear from my parents ever again, I got home from work one day to find my aunt sitting in the TV room with a friend of hers. The friend was someone that I'd come to know over the years. Not quite an aunt, but definitely someone I knew and liked. My aunt told me to sit down, and for the first time in a long time, I got that same creeping dread that I was about to hear some bad news. I remember just straight up asking my aunt, did they find Mom and Dad? And she said no, but that the thing that they wanted to talk to me about was related to them. And like I said, I'd long accepted the idea that they disappeared somehow, possibly in like a kidnap or home invasion gone wrong or something. So to learn that there was some kind of new development, all I felt was curiosity, and really nothing more. My aunt then told me in the next couple of days I was probably going to hear some stuff about my mom and dad. I asked what kind of stuff and from who. My aunt and her friend looked at each other, and then my aunt said, "You're going to hear some stuff about your mom and dad, and it's going to be in the news or on TV and probably in the paper too." As you can probably imagine, this brought everything to a whole different level. It was one thing to have this personal tragedy of my parents just disappearing, but then to not only hear that it was about to be broadcast to the whole world, but that new details were about to emerge. I actually know what people mean when they say that something made their head completely spin. My aunt then told me that in order for me to understand what I was going to hear, I needed some context, and that context was this. My mom and dad were good people, as in their hearts had always been in the right place, but they made their money in a way that wasn't at all legal. Then, prior to their disappearance, something happened which may or may not have been related to them vanishing. All I needed to know is that that thing was a mistake, a terrible one, and not something my dad would have ever done on purpose. I asked my aunt what that thing was, and she told me, but honestly, you're better hearing it in the way the newsreaders talked about it, because if there was one thing that I've learned, it's that the truth really doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what everyone chooses to believe is the truth, and I guess a lot of that is dictated by whoever writes the headlines. But around the time of my 14th birthday, a truck with one of those cabs, the kind that you use to transport frozen seafood, was found abandoned at a truck stop just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. It sat there for a day or two before someone finally called the cops, who showed up, inspected the thing, and then busted open the cab to see what was inside. They found a whole bunch of dead, frozen meat in there. It just didn't belong to any farm animal or sea creature. It belonged to the 30-plus corpses of illegal migrants that had hopped into the wrong truck before it came across the border. It caused a big stir down in the Southwest, but not up where we lived, so I literally didn't hear anything about it until my aunt told me about it. Anyway, the FBI had been hacking their way up the chain of human traffickers before they finally figured out who was in charge of that particular trafficking route, and that person was my father. I remember seeing his pictures on the news and thanking God that my aunt had given me the heads up, because if I had no idea, and I saw all that, I think I'd have puked and passed out or something. My aunt had told me that my dad just wanted to help people get into the country who wouldn't be able to do so otherwise for whatever reason. If it meant that he could make money doing it, then fine, it was a living. I guess that all those dead migrants, that was his big mistake. The buck stopped at him after all those accidental deaths were discovered, and I don't know if my parents just wanted to get ahead of everything and left right away, or someone in the same organization decided that he was a loose end that needed tying up. But either way, the timing of it, as in the fact that the deaths happened just a few weeks before they disappeared, meant it was probably related to their disappearance in some way. And as you can imagine, it's not something I particularly enjoy talking about with people, but this way, anonymously I mean, it actually feels kind of good to get it all off of my chest. I don't know where my parents are, if they're alive or not, or if I could ever find it in my heart to forgive them. But I hope that one day I can at least get the opportunity to talk to them, even if it is some kind of deathbed exchange. I know they did some truly awful things, and I know they deserve to be punished for what they did, but they're still my parents, and I've still missed them every single day since the moment I found out that they were gone. When I was a kid, I always believed my paternal grandmother was no longer with us. We only ever visited family on my mom's side, and we'd get visits from my paternal aunt and uncle, but I always figured that we never saw or spoke of my dad's mother because she was no longer with us. Well, as it turns out, she was alive when I was growing up, and she didn't pass on until I was in my early 20s. In their defense, Mom and Dad never actually said she was dead. They just never, ever brought her up. To me, Grandma and Grandpa were literally the names of the two older folks that I visited every other weekend, and for years, I didn't even realize those weren't their names, and that I was supposed to have another pair of grandparents on my dad's side. I'm sure I might have asked at some point, I just don't remember it, and so I grew up thinking both my dad's parents were deceased. But then, years later, my paternal grandmother actually dies, at which point my parents decided that then was the best time to tell me about her. I don't know why they took it upon themselves to do so, but there's a lot I don't understand about my parents, so excuse me if I just toss that onto the stack of other crap that mystifies me about them. They could have told me all about what I'm about to tell you when she was alive, when I could have actually done something about it. But they waited until there was nothing I could do or say about it that would really matter, and I guess I still resent them a little for that. But then I can already hear you asking, what awful thing did Grandma do that meant my parents didn't breathe a word of her until she was dead? Well, I'm about to tell you. So my dad's side of the family is all Polish, and his mom was, well, kinda crazy. It wasn't her insisting on him marrying a Polish girl that made her crazy. That was a pretty common thing. It was all the crazy things that she did that made everyone think that she was crazy. My grandpa pretty much hated her. He only stayed because they were hardcore Catholic, and she made life pretty hard for my dad and his two siblings. But they didn't know any different. They just thought that that was family. They didn't realize other families actually made an attempt to be happy, or how other parents had some semblance of emotional maturity. And in my dad's case, he only realized things could be different when he met my mom. Her family is Cuban, and they're crazy in their own way, trust me. But the grandparents I grew up with are some of the most loving and welcoming people you could ever wish to meet. All they gave a damn about was if Dad treated Mom okay, and if he did, so they treated him like their own flesh and blood. Dad put off introducing Mom to Grandma. His own dad had passed by that point because he knew that she'd only react badly. But Mom being Mom, she insisted that they at least give it a try, so Dad calls Grandma and tells her that he has a girlfriend. Grandma was acting all pleased for him at least, but Dad could tell it was just an act. She'd only be truly happy once she'd heard the girl was Polish, so when she heard Mom's background was Cuban, she was not happy. She wasn't particularly unhappy about it though. Like she didn't slam the phone down or start giving my dad the cold shoulder, and she actually agreed to the offer of a meeting over dinner. And this was a huge thing. Dad thought she'd go nuts if he brought home a Cuban girl, so to have her even agree to a meeting was like a really hopeful sign. Anyway, so a few weeks go by and it finally comes time for Mom and Grandma's first meeting. Grandma insists on doing the cooking, and when Mom and Dad arrive, she told them that she made a kind of stew called bigos. Bigos is actually pretty good. Like imagine a stew with a little fruity fragrance to it, but just like my paternal grandma, I didn't even know it existed until I was like 23. And then weirdly enough, it was for the exact same reason too. So things are actually going much better than expected. The bigos is good, Grandma's being nice, but then Mom seems to have a real problem with her food. Mom wasn't a fussy eater or anything, but she was clearly just trying to be nice when she was calling it delicious. But then, it really was delicious. Grandma had clearly worked hard on it, and even way back then, Mom was open-minded and adventurous with food. The whole thing had my dad sitting there thinking, just what the hell is going on? Dinner carries on for a little while longer, and Mom throws in the towel after just a few more spoonfuls. Grandma asks if she's okay, and Mom says that she must be feeling a little under the weather. But then, suddenly, seconds later, Mom actually projectile pukes onto the table, like it caught her completely by surprise. She covers her mouth, totally mortified, then runs off to the bathroom to finish throwing up. Dad is completely flabbergasted by what's going on, but he figures Mom must really be sick or something, so he starts looking around the kitchen for some paper towels or a cloth or whatever to clean up Mom's puke. Only then does Grandma actually react to what's going on and tells my dad to sit down and finish his food while she's going off to get the paper towels. And to him, this doesn't make one single solitary bit of sense. Grandma was a huge germaphobe, and there's no way that she'd allow anyone to eat on a table with vomit on it, especially not her food. So to Dad, there had to be some ulterior motive for her unusual behavior. She starts shooing him back towards the dinner table, but he insists on checking in the cabinet under the kitchen sink for a dish towel. But then when he does, Grandma actually puts herself in the way of the cabinets, legit like she's trying to hide something. Things are starting to look pretty dark at this point. Mom got randomly sick, and Grandma looks like she's hiding something, so, as you can imagine, my dad is starting to freak out. He basically shoves Grandma out of the way, opens the kitchen cabinet, and there, half hidden by a bunch of plastic tubs and kitchen utensils, was a bottle of bleach. And here's what you gotta understand about Grandma, or at least this is what I heard from my dad. Grandma was crazy, really crazy. And remember I said that she was a total germaphobe? Well, she was terrified of chemicals too. Everything that had to be all natural, including all the cleaning products that she'd used. Grandma used to use a lot of old-fashioned Castile soap, a lot of baking soda, and a lot of salt and a lot of cornstarch. For anyone scoffing at the idea of using cornstarch to clean windows or shampoo carpets, it might seem nuts, but that's just what people used before chemical cleaning products became household items. Grandma didn't trust any kind of chemical, but she did trust stuff like white vinegar to clean almost everything, which is why my dad, aunt, and uncle grew up in a house that perennially smelled like vinegar, and all despise the smell of that stuff now as a result. So the fact that there was suddenly this bottle of bleach under the kitchen sink, my dad said it was this moment of awful realization. It hadn't been that Mom hadn't enjoyed her stew. Grandma had tried to poison her. The way Dad tells it, he never figured in a zillion years that Grandma would ever admit to doing something like that, so at first, he didn't think that there was any point asking her. But then at the same time, he couldn't not ask her, so he does. But instead of the lie that he expected to hear, Grandma told him the truth. Yes, she had put bleach in Mom's stew, but it was just a tiny amount, not enough to really make her sick. She didn't want to kill Dad's new girlfriend, but she was hoping to kill the baby, if there was one growing inside of her. Grandma figured that the only reason Dad was bringing this girl home to meet her was because Mom was pregnant, and that's just the way Grandma was. No one could do anything for any good reason or out of the kindness of their heart. There had to be some ulterior motive, something bad that they were masking with the good. So when she heard about Dad's new girlfriend, she was convinced it was the worst-case scenario, and in her mind, that worst-case scenario involved a non-Polish girl being pregnant with her grandchild. Now luckily, Mom was not pregnant, but obviously that didn't matter in the least. Dad had known Grandma to do some screwed-up things in her time, but trying to poison one of his girlfriends was obviously a different thing entirely. It obviously caused a huge fight, and I mean a huge one. Things got smashed, the cops got called. Grandma threatened to stab herself and had the cops pointing their guns at her, because she'd suddenly forgot all of her English and started talking only in Polish with a big old kitchen knife in her hand. It was a huge thing that everyone in their neighborhood talked about for a long time. But in the immediate aftermath, all my dad cared about was what was going to happen between his mom and his girlfriend. Incredibly, Mom told him that she wouldn't press charges against Grandma, but only under one condition. She didn't mind if my dad kept in contact with her, but she didn't want my grandma around if they started a family. That way, Grandma didn't get a charge, all respective relationships could continue, and any future children they had, i.e. me, would be 100% safe from that psycho wannabe baby killer. My dad agreed, and kept in touch with his mom for a while too. He tried to get her to apologize, but she wouldn't, because she literally doesn't even regret trying to perform a home abortion on my mom. Dad cut her off when he realized how far gone she was. She'd been getting worse and worse ever since her husband, my dad's dad, had passed away from a heart attack, but I guess no one realized just how bad she'd gotten until she tried to delete future me. I know I wasn't actually at risk in that situation, but you get the idea. I don't resent my mom and dad for keeping me from having a relationship with my paternal grandma. I resent them because I never got the chance to tell her to burn in hell. Maybe if she came to realize what a terrible thing she'd done, maybe then we'd have been able to have a relationship. But hearing how unrepentant she was, how her own son had tried his best and she threw it back in his face, that makes me hate her in ways that are impossible to put into words. When I was growing up, I had a friend who told me this wild story about his family's history. It wasn't totally unbelievable, but it was very, very far-fetched, and whatever shred of credibility it had evaporated when he asked me, "Don't tell my mom I told you this." We were 12, going on 13 at the time, so I was old enough and smart enough to realize that when my friend told me, "Please don't try and verify this," what I should be hearing was, nothing I just said was true. But then, the more I thought about it, the more I felt kind of insulted that my buddy thought that I was dumb enough to believe such an outrageous story. And so I took it upon myself to try and embarrass him a little, and concocted a scheme to inflict some petty revenge. I guess that doesn't make me sound like a very good friend, but we were just dumb kids, and if anything, this whole incident actually brought us closer over the long run. But at the same time, I just couldn't resist myself, and in doing so, I well and truly kicked a hornet's nest. But anyway, so I'm sitting at the kitchen table in my friend's house. Me and him are having some dinner, and his mom is kind of wandering around the kitchen doing dishes and stuff. The three of us are talking about nothing in particular, when suddenly I asked my buddy's mom, "Hey, Mrs. P, is it true your family used to be gangsters?" I expected her to say something like, "No, what are you talking about?" and for my buddy to just get embarrassed or something. But instead, she froze, and without looking around at us, said to my buddy in a voice filled with tension, "Tell your friend that he has to go home, now." My buddy looked like he was about to pass out, like he turned so pale that he was a little green, and then he did as his mom asked. He told me that I had to go home, and I did. As I rode my bike back over to my parents' place, I felt like the biggest piece of crap in the history of pieces of crap. But I also couldn't believe what he had told me was true. It sounded so much like bullcrap that I was convinced that it was just that. But from what I could tell from his mom's reaction, every word my buddy said was true. She'd obviously sworn him to secrecy, and he trusted me enough to tell me all about his family's dark past. And then in response, I'd completely and utterly betrayed him, all while unwittingly relishing the chance to do so. He was grounded for a long time afterward, and his mom took literally years to warm back up to me. She didn't try to keep us separated or anything. I guess she just didn't like the fact that I knew. And this, all of you who are patiently listening to me, I appreciate that, is what I knew. Back during Prohibition days, my buddy's family were the most prolific bootleggers in the entire Ozarks. They covered southern Missouri, western Tennessee, northeast Oklahoma, northern Arkansas, and part of Kansas. They also supplied elements of the Italian mafia over in St. Louis, who in turn sold the booze for a huge markup. They were based over near a place called Ava in Missouri, but when they started out there was already a bunch of different outfits running liquor, and they were doing it in a kind of syndicate. They controlled the market, leaving no room for anyone else. So, how did my buddy's family muscle their way onto the scene, you might ask? Well, the answer to that is sheer goddamn brutality. A group of around a dozen different brothers, uncles, and cousins, all young, wild, and hungry enough to do something so goddamn crazy, they get together and they decide that they're going to go to war. Only they don't fight fair at all. The bootlegging syndicate idea of fighting fair involved hosing each other down with Tommy guns and bars in broad daylight. But my buddy's family, they killed those men in their homes, in their beds. They took their time over it, and they never, ever left any witnesses. They were ruthless in the very sense of the word. They didn't care if they had to kill women or old men or kids, and no one could know who they were. And in the end, they just sort of ran out of people to kill. Any bootlegger with the brain between their ears got the hell out of Douglas County. It was all about who wanted it the most, and my buddy's family simply showed that they did. Eventually, the family took over the entire bootlegging business in Douglas County and began to spread out to all the areas they ended up covering. But then everywhere they went, they kept on stamping out the competition in the only way they knew how. Whenever they expanded into a new area, the competition could either join forces with them and keep a cut of their earnings, or they could just pack up, move someplace else, and carry on keeping all their money. Anyone who defied them, they took it like a personal insult, like they were taking food out of their mouths. And what was the old-timey punishment for stealing food? Execution. My buddy told me that there was this small-time distillery someplace that didn't want to shut up shop when the family rolled into town. They were run by another family, not so different from my buddies, who only wanted to put a few extra dollars in their pocket during the hardest times in living memory. It took them months to track the distillery down, and when they did, it was a massacre. They ambushed their competitors, shot them up, tortured the survivors, then trashed their equipment and burned their bodies. And the thing is, it was a celebration, you know? It had taken them long enough to track those boys down, so it felt good to them, like something worth celebrating. They drank, danced, and played the fiddle around the fire the slain bootleggers' bodies were roasting on. And one time, and this was the part which made me think, there's no way in a million years this actually happened, the family were hunted by some federal men, like from whatever they had before the FBI. The family simply killed those men too, didn't wait for him to come look for him either. They just found out where those old bureau men were lodging in town and then sent some boys over in the night to rig their entire boarding house with dynamite. They killed the landlady, the clerk on duty, and a handful of other guests. But most importantly, it got all 4 bureau men while they were asleep in their bunks. Poor bastards never knew what hit them. And after that, the feds rolled into Douglas County, intent on putting an end to all the violence. They hunted down my buddy's family, sending any survivors fleeing out of state. And that's how my buddy's family ended up where they were, far from Missouri, and far from places where their names had become a byword for death and destruction. My buddy said that he found all this out from a senior citizen uncle of his who let slip and told him and a bunch of his cousins all about it when he was drunk one time. He then mentioned it to his mom, and it caused a huge fight, and he was sworn to guard the family secret at an age when he was nowhere near ready to do so. And years later, he told me. I asked his mom about it over dinner, and well, you already heard the rest of that story. And that should have been the death of our friendship right there, and I guess it did deliver something of a knockout punch that left our companionship on the mat for a while. But after that, he could have told me that the moon was made of cheese, and I'd have believed every word. It's hard to find that kind of trust in life, and my buddy knew it too. He knew damned well that I'd believe every single word that he told me from there on out, and I guess he understood the value of that just as well as I did. We reunited in spirit during our sophomore year of high school, and we've been friends ever since. That friendship has survived a lot of rough seas too, but it's always survived because there are a few things as rare or as powerful as unquestioning trust. It was only in the last couple of years that I found out how an uncle of mine had been touched as a child, and that the perpetrator was actually a priest at the family's church. This was way back in the 1950s in rural Pennsylvania, when there was no sex ed and when kids were told to religiously obey the commands of their elders. By the time he even realized what was going on, he knew no one would believe him, and there was no getting out of Sunday school either, so he was basically stuck getting abused from the ages of 10 to 13. By 14, he was avoiding church entirely, which caused a huge rift between him and my grandma, and then to combat all the stress which that caused him, he started drinking more and more heavily until he basically was a functioning alcoholic by age 18. And by the time he was 20, he was stealing cars, taking benzos and quaaludes. Then when the law finally caught up with him, he was given 2 choices: join the army and set himself straight, or spend the next 6 years in jail. He chooses the army, thinking the 3 years as a soldier will beat 6 in the slammer. But boy was he wrong, because just a year into his service, Uncle Sam went into South Vietnam, and my uncle went with him. To me, this is where the story gets really weird, because if my uncle did what he did next as a way of getting out of Vietnam, then I'd get it. In fact, a bolder man than I might even say that it was the smart thing to do. But at least officially speaking, my uncle's service record was impeccable. He served his country honorably, did 1 tour, came home, then he was discharged once he'd completed his contract. My mom said that the whole family thought that he turned his life around, but after a few months of being back home, my uncle started to act really, really strangely. So while he was over in Vietnam, my uncle had found religion. I guess it all makes sense in the world to get a little spiritual when you're so close to death every day, and when he got back, he joined a local church and spent a fair amount of his spare time helping out. But then one day, he just stopped going, and he didn't find any other church to go to either. Instead, he started acting depressed. He stopped going to work, stopped returning calls, so my grandma and grandpa reached out to the church that he suddenly stopped going to and asked the pastor if he had any idea what was going on. The pastor was over the moon to hear from some of my uncle's relatives, and he had had no other way of getting in touch or getting information about him. My grandparents figured that they were getting somewhere, but then the pastor hit them with some very terrifying news. My uncle had claimed to have been experiencing stigmata. And for those of you that don't know, stigmata is a Catholic thing, and it's when a person experiences unexplained wounds or scars that occur in the same place that Jesus was wounded during his crucifixion. We're talking wounds on the palms or wrists, wounds on the feet, near the heart, or on the person's head or back. My uncle had them all. Only his pastor said the wounds were quite obviously self-inflicted. He said the one example of stigmata that he actually believed was a girl in Brazil whose stigmata consisted of a sudden and unexplainable lack of pigmentation in the affected area, and that the general consensus among most men of God was that the Lord does not inflict physical wounds and call them a blessing. Stigmata is a reminder of Christ's sacrifice, not a reenactment of it, and when the pastor confronted my uncle with this idea, that he was hurting himself, my uncle freaked out, stormed out of the church, and that's pretty much the start of him going AWOL. As soon as they heard that he was potentially harming himself, my grandparents enlisted the help of a few friends. Then they drove over to my uncle's place to stage what I guess these days you'll probably call an intervention. They went over to his place, and at first it seemed like he wasn't home. But when someone peeked through a window and saw blood on the walls, they smashed their way inside and found my uncle upstairs in his bathroom. They caught him doing it, cutting himself, and they basically dragged him off to the psych ward after convincing him to put the knife down. He was later diagnosed as suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, which had latched onto his newfound religion with manifesting religious-based hallucinations and delusions. My family had him committed to the state psychiatric hospital, and he seemed to get a little better there, but was still very much in need of round-the-clock treatment to prevent him from doing any further damage to himself. A few years later, the state governor closed the facility my uncle was staying in, and he was basically given a choice between living at a group home or living on his own. Only those that had improved since their committal were given such a choice, and my uncle chose his freedom. My family never stopped being concerned for his mental and physical health, but he lived out the rest of his life in relative peace until he died of liver cancer when I was just a kid. My parents didn't tell me this story until I was way older, which made sense given how freaking dark it is. I just wish I had a chance to meet him. He lived one hell of a life, and even with all the crap he went through, he ended up finding a degree of peace in his final few years. It might sound weird, but it kind of gives me hope. He fought in a war, was addicted to drugs, and went through a hellish kind of mental illness, but then managed to get past it. Or at least he got past it enough to live a somewhat normal life for a while, before his long overdue date with destiny. My grandmother emigrated from the U.S. from Estonia just before the outbreak of World War II. You might think that that'd mean that she'd avoided a lot of tragedy, escaping Europe before the war and all. But in actual fact, it was her own personal tragedy that prompted the move, or to be more specific, the death of my grandfather. My mother was an only child at the time, so she remembers my grandmother and other siblings being very sad about something, whereas she was just confused. She didn't understand where her father had gone, only that she should be sad that he was never coming back. Sometime later, they moved to America, and many years passed before my mother explored the subject of my grandfather's death in more detail. But when she finally did, she was horrified about what she'd heard. Originally, all my mother knew about my grandfather's death was that it had been a sudden and tragic accident. He'd been out walking one day when an innocent misstep caused him to bash his head onto a jagged rock, Then, before anyone realized that he had hurt himself, it was too late. That's what my mother and her siblings were told, that it was all a tragic and unforeseen accident. But that was only partially true. The story goes that my grandfather used to wake up real early for work. I'm talking pre-dawn. He used to make his own breakfast, head out to work before anyone else woke up, and then he'd return home late again in the evening after his long shift working at a lumber mill. One morning, my grandmother wakes up and she goes downstairs to find no dirty plates from my grandpa's breakfast, only a small scribbled note saying that he was gone and he was never coming back. Obviously, this shocked my grandmother, but mainly because it was completely out of the blue. They were happily married, at least that's what my grandmother says, so his sudden departure made her question his mental state. My grandmother then walked all the way into the nearest town from the farm that they were living on, told the constable that my grandfather was missing and that she was concerned for him. The constable then organized a search of the surrounding area in the hopes of uncovering the man's trail, but no one found him, and no one appeared to have seen him either. Once the sun went down, the constable suspended the search until the following morning and promised my grandmother that he'd extend the range of the search to the surrounding towns. But the very next morning, before the search could recommence, a local altar boy went running to the constabulary to report something awful. There was a dead body lying in the church's cemetery, and upon investigation, they found it was my grandpa. A doctor was summoned to the scene to determine the cause of death, and following a short inspection, he declared my grandfather had frozen to death. He had simply walked into the cemetery at some point over the previous 24 hours, laid down, and then just stayed still until he froze. He was lying directly on top of this one particular grave, too, so perfectly aligned with where the casket would be that it terrified the townsfolk when word filtered down to them. The grave was an old one, and its occupant bore no relation to my grandfather. According to the inscription, the deceased woman passed when my grandfather was just a child. There's a chance the pair may have met in some capacity, but there's no way that they had any kind of personal relationship, and the reason for this particular grave selection remained a mystery. The official explanation was that my grandfather had simply lost his mind, walked off into the cemetery, and was dead before my grandmother even knew that he was missing. The cemetery was small and isolated, and it wasn't every day that someone tended to it, so there was a chance my grandfather had lain there for a whole day before that altar boy finally found him. Folks tried to work out why he'd gone to that particular grave too, and that led to all kinds of really gross speculation. If he wanted to take his own life, there were far more effective and far less poetic ways to do it. And if it was indeed him doing so, what had been bothering my grandfather so terribly that he felt the need to actually take his own life? The never-ending mystery, all those unanswered questions were like a curse on my grandmother, and not long after my grandfather passed, she left Estonia and emigrated to America, like I said. She told my mother when she was an adult and had always regretted doing so. She then made her promise never to tell me until she was dead. She had lived with the pain of it and had seen what it had done to my mother, but she also knew that I had the right to know what really happened. My grandmother's only request was that she wouldn't be there to see it break my heart, in the same way that it had broken my mother's heart when she learned the truth. My mother became obsessed with the subject, and it tore my grandmother up to see her putting all this time and effort into something so fruitless. The only person who really knew what happened that morning was my grandfather, and unless there truly is such a thing as an afterlife, then our chance of getting answers died with him. I've accepted that we're never going to know what happened to him, and I'm inclined to believe that he suffered some kind of manic-depressive episode, and that's all there is to it. But as Mom told me, there are others in our extended family, mostly back in Estonia, who think that something considerably more frightening and considerably more supernatural occurred that morning when my grandfather walked off towards that cemetery. Personally, I think that's a bunch of crap, and that any kind of speculation like that is an insult to his memory. But they really do think that it was some kind of curse, that the woman whose grave my grandfather laid on was some kind of witch, and that my grandmother fled Estonia to escape that curse. I can only safely say that neither myself nor my mother or grandmother believe there's any kind of supernatural element to my grandfather's death. To us, there's nothing more terrifying than the idea of someone just walking off into an icy cemetery, laying down and then fighting off every overwhelming urge to seek warmth before finally blacking out forever. Because if it can happen to someone as loving, hard-working, and stable as my grandfather, then it can happen to just about anyone. I can't believe I'm about to tell you this, but I made a throwaway email and I'm not going to use any real names or places, so let's just go. The biggest, darkest secret in my entire family involves my granddad, his little brother, and a little Southeast Asian country called Vietnam. Granddad, his youngest brother, so technically my great-uncle, and two of their close mates were lucky enough to have their numbers called in the draft for Vietnam. Obviously, none of them wanted to go, but if they didn't, they'd get arrested, lose their jobs, and it'd be a world of hurt for each of them. So instead, they had to come up with a plan to get themselves out of it. The plan was they'd drive out to get their medicals done together, but on the way there, they'd have themselves a little accident and drive their car into a tree or a ditch or something. Obviously, the plan was to get too injured to get sent to Vietnam, but not so injured as to be permanently crippled or what have you. But most importantly, it'd have to look like an accident so that nobody got pinched and sent to jail for being a draft dodger. At the time, they were all living way out in the middle of nowhere in Western Australia, so all they had to do was say they swerved to miss a kangaroo, hit a tree, then Bob's your uncle. They're just too bloody banged up to go to war. But then, things didn't quite pan out like that. My granddad was driving the car, his friend was in the passenger seat, and the two others were in the back, his brother included. They were driving along when they see this lone tree coming up in the distance. My granddad asked all the lads, "You ready, boys?" And they said, "Yeah, let her rip and skip." Then, wham. The car smashes into the tree doing about 40 kilometers an hour. Granddad's right leg gets smashed in an instant, no Vietnam for him. The guy behind him breaks his arm and some ribs, no Vietnam for him either. Their other mate gets a few broken bones too, meaning no playing at being a soldier for him anytime soon. There was just one massive problem. Because this was rural Australia in the 60s, wearing seatbelts really wasn't compulsory. But then, knowing that they were going to be in a big crash, my granddad had worn his, as had his two mates in the back and passenger seat. But his little brother, hoping that leaving it off would make for more debilitating injuries, had neglected to wear it, and the impact had ruptured his spleen. Nobody had found the car for an hour or two, and neither had anyone in it factored serious internal injuries into their genius-level scheme. My great-uncle was dead before they could even get him to a hospital, and my granddad never, ever forgave himself. I only found out in the last couple of years following his death from heart disease. My grandma was the only one he ever told, as far as we know, and she didn't tell my mother until after he died, which is when I found out too. After the funeral, we found a small box in their bedroom when we were cleaning out the house. It had a clipping from the local newspaper at the time about the accident. It said that they had swerved to miss a kangaroo and called it a tragedy. I don't think my mother told any of her siblings, so technically this is still the family secret. I guess now you're all in on it, so why don't you keep it hush-hush? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember...